Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivanna and Sam.
Good afternoon, Willie. I'm really excited to have you on what will be this third edition of the Transformation in Trials podcast.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here with you.
Yeah, no, we were super excited to get you on the show. You've got a great background in this industry, a really great reputation as well. We like to talk about all things transformational in clinical trials. For each episode, we try and hone in on a specific segment of the clinical trials landscape. And I think given your background, honing in on eCOA and patient-facing technologies as a broad topic would be really interesting to explore with you today. So maybe as a way of getting started, you could give us a little bit of background about yourself, Willie. I've heard your story on numerous occasions, and I'm always fascinated and slightly puzzled as to how a former veterinary surgeon gets into becoming a serial entrepreneur, as you call yourself. But rather than me talk our listeners through it, maybe you can take us through that journey.
Sure. So I always wanted to be a vet, so I don't know what happened either. After I suffered through 6 years of vet school. It happened by accident, to be quite honest. Some friends of mine started to work for Parexel, and they were looking for additional staff. So I was asked if I wanted to just start there. I was still a student at the university, so I started Parexel in data entry. So my first job was entering paper diaries for a contraception study into an electronic system, into a data management system. So I thought I'd do that for a year or two, pay off my student loans, and just get started on that. And here we are. My 25th anniversary is coming up next year in March. So that was 1998. So next year is my 25-year anniversary, and I still have the boots and the wellies and some of the equipment, but I never went back to veterinary medicine since I started entering data diaries. So I did that for a couple of years. Worked, as you say, with different technologies. I stayed with Parexel for about 6.5 years. I moved to the UK, worked there for about 2 years within their technology arm. I managed one of the first two studies in eDiaries with PhD at the time was the partner that we worked with as a project manager, then also in business development later. Then I moved to the US. So we worked even more and closer with in Boston with PhD and with Perceptive. And that's, I think, where I got hooked during that time, during these 5 years on eCOA or ePRO at the time. So we didn't call it eCOA at the time, it was ePRO. And then eventually I wanted to learn more about the whole PRO side of things and ePRO side of things. And the scientific company at the time was In Vivo Data. So I joined In Vivo Data and moved back to Europe, worked there for 2 years. Learned a lot from people like Sol Schiffman, Arthur Stone, Brian Tiplady, John Putty, and the other scientists they had. So that was really good. It was a good time. But then after 2 years, I also figured that we need to do something more on the operation side of things. And I joined the company called Viasys at the time. They were then acquired and spin-offs, and various things happened in 5 years. And in the end, I ended up working for ERT, like a lot of people at that time, because ERT acquired a lot of companies. So during that time, I built devices. Actually, we built a dedicated piece of hardware as a diary. We call it ViaPet from Viasys and Pet, right? So I thought it was a good name. Did that for 5 years. That worked really well. And then I decided it's probably time. I had moved to Ireland in the meantime. So I worked from Ireland for ERT at the time, and figured it would be good to join a CRO again because there's a lot of studies were run by CROs, and I felt that it would be good for me to work within the CRO space again. So I joined ICON in Dublin and worked for them for just over 6 years or 6.5 years. In the end, I was head of innovation, where we built a lot of prototypes and software and a lot of partnerships and did a lot of scientific work, did a lot of work on BYOD and how it can work. And I worked with the agencies quite a bit, FDA. So I kept them abreast on what we were thinking, what we were doing. I also then had the opportunity to be the initial vice director of the ePRO consortium representing the vendors, so the techies. That was very good. We did a lot of work during that time, which is still being used today. So I think we did a pretty good job there to put out some standards. And then 4 years ago, or 3.5, almost 4 years ago, I started my own business as Muehlhausen Consulting. So trying to work with vendors and pharma companies and CROs to progress further within the eCOA space. And last year then, I co-founded Safira Clinical Research with Gauri Nagrani in Toronto, Canada. And so we've been, next week, actually, we have our first year anniversary of Safira. And so we're working with quite a few sponsors and tech companies now and try to move ePRO along. And so that's how I moved from chasing cows in a barn to basically chasing vendors.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, fascinating background, Willie, and I learned something slightly different about your career path every time we have discussions like this, so appreciate that context. Now, we have a broad church in terms of listeners here, and to you and I, the term eCOA, ePRO are common terms. Maybe for those that aren't as in-depth into this topic, you could just give us the quick elevator pitch as to what eCOA is, what its value is, why it's being used predominantly in this space at the moment.
Happy to do that. And I get this question all the time because, as you say, not everyone is dealing with that on a day-to-day basis, and not everyone has been doing it for 24 years now as well. So I feel like a dinosaur in many ways. So the good news is I'm not the only one. There's others in the zoo as well that are dinosaurs. So I'm not the only one. So capturing data from patients directly has been around for a very long time. This is not really that new. But there was always the perception that patients probably wouldn't answer the questionnaires necessarily when they were supposed to answer them, and therefore they would introduce some bias. So there's the theory or the idea of recall bias. So basically, if you enter a questionnaire and it says, try to remember how you did that over the last couple of weeks or week or even a couple of days, you, depending on how you feel at that moment, you just introduce bias to that, because if you're feeling good, then you would probably think that everything was pretty good over the last week or so, or 2 weeks. But if you feel bad or down, then that will reflect in your answers as well. So there's that recall bias. The other thing is that you answer more randomly if you answer after the fact versus closer to the event. So we call it ecological momentary assessment. And researchers, as mentioned before, like Brian Tiblady, Sol Schiffman, Arthur Stone, have done a lot of research in that space. So when these new, what we called PDAs, personal digital assistants, came about, so for people who don't know that, these were kind of smartphones without the phone functionality. Companies like CRF Health and PhD and In Vivo Data were founded all roughly around the same time, 25 plus years ago. And so we then, as an industry, tried to set these up to capture the data from patients directly by providing them with a Palm Pilot, for example, because nobody had a Palm Pilot at the time. They were just a rare species. And to be honest, they weren't that useful either at the time with the limited functionality that they had. But they were good enough. They were really good to capture data from patients where we had an audit trail. So we knew when patient actually did it, and we could limit time windows. And to prove that actually was beneficial, In Vivo Data did a study with a small patient cohort where they compared patients entering a daily diary on paper versus on another paper version, which was basically instrumented. So they had one of these little notebooks, and you had to open a zipper to open the notebook, and there was a photocell in there. So it only tracked basically when light came into the device or into the notebook. And by looking at the timestamps through this photocell, they could show some interesting data that actually made it very clear that patients are not as compliant as the paper would suggest. So you may have data for 95% of the days, but one of the things was that they found out that about, I think it was 11% of the data was pre-filled. So they filled in how their pain levels were before they actually had the pain. So, and that triggered a couple of knee-jerk reactions in the industry. And it was basically proof that paper was not really good when patients enter information in an unsupervised environment. So then years later, after that, the FDA put out a guideline to show, what kind of proof they expect from us in the industry to show that patients answered when they did. So that's when this electronic implementation got another boost. So we're actually trying to do this now, and we need to keep, I think some of us need to keep that in mind. We're doing it to make sure that we get good data from the patients and make it as easy for patients to do, which then led to, we come to that probably at a later point today, but we come to the point that we use BYOD, and so it's all about making it easy for patients. But we also went ahead and did not just capture ePRO, so from patients, now we have electronic systems, so we now capture clinician reported outcomes as well, observer reported outcomes, which is either caregiver or parent, for example, or a family member. And we have performance outcomes. So these four are all together called eCOA now, electronic clinical outcomes assessments. But the ePRO piece is what I'm particularly interested in and what I've been working in the last few years.
Got it. Fascinating stuff, and I think that's made it really clear, hopefully for our listeners as well. I think one thing that I always thought about when it came to eCOA was that if I'm in a clinical trial and I'm a patient, I have my own mobile device. I don't want to have another device to enter data into and then have my own personal device to basically run the applications that I use day to day, Facebook, whatever you want to use a personal mobile phone for. How have things moved on since then? I think you kind of touched upon BYOD, but maybe you can take us through that journey and see whether this type of technology really has become patient-centric, for want of a better term, and fits into somebody's usual kind of pattern of life, so to speak.
Sure. And that was a long trip to get to where we are today. So authors who own these questionnaires had an idea, and the FDA would go with that, how we need to make sure that if you migrate a paper version of a questionnaire into an electronic platform, that you don't introduce any bias, how patients answer the question. So the actual form factor shouldn't affect how they answer the questionnaire. Changes that we make on a regular basis is, for example, you have on a piece of paper, on a page, you have 10 questions probably. That turns into one question per screen. So this is a change in itself. Now, some questionnaires have questions in there say, please circle a number from a paper version, but you can't really circle a number on the device. So we use mark or select as neutral verbiage, basically. So there are always small changes. And then ePRO got together many years ago and put a task force together to check and to probably give some guidance to figure out if all changes are equal and what do we need to do depending on the changes that we make, whether we need to do some testing or what kind of testing do we need to do to make sure that we can prove that these two versions, so the paper version and the electronic version, are the same from a patient's perspective, or are the same enough that even if there's small differences, that these differences don't matter, basically. And this is probably a more better way of looking at it. It's a risk-based approach. There's three different ways to look at it, or to do some, to check whether these versions are equivalent. And when you do a provision device, you have very clear control over what these questionnaires look like on your device or on your devices if you have more than one, like a tablet and a mobile phone, for example. And we've done a lot of work in the past, and a lot of studies have been conducted to show that these things are equivalent, these versions. And then we came along, and because if you want to do a study where you want to use BYOD, on the Apple side of things, the iOS side of things, there's still a limited number of devices that are out there at any given time. But when you go into the Android side of things, there's dozens of devices out there. So that's can't be controlled. So we had to take a step back and look at it. Is there a way to standardize how these questionnaires look like so that we don't have to test every questionnaire on every phone type? And that's what we did with the ePRO consortium and some work that I did with my study team at ICON. And we could actually show with all the publications work that we've done that if you stay within certain parameters, that doesn't make a difference. So you can use whatever device you want. And what the first work that we did is to figure out how many different ways of asking questions are there actually. So how many different ways of asking and answering a question are there? And we call them widgets on the technical side of things. You can call it scale types would be another way of describing them. And we found that there's beyond the normal stuff, what I consider normal, which is like a multiple choice or a date picker, time picker, yes, no. But these are really, it's a scale specific or questionnaire specific would be a verbal rating scale, a numeric rating scale, and a visual analog scale. The rest is kind of normal stuff that we see on a day-to-day basis. So we did a lot of work on that one to show that if you stay within certain parameters, then you're fine. You can use any device. The size doesn't really matter in that context either. So one of the reasons why we also agreed as an ePRO consortium and the industry that we have one question per screen. Even if you have a big screen, you can 3 or 4 in there. We wanted to take that parameter number of questions out of the equation so that you don't have to show that 3 is the same as 4 or 2 or 1. So we went with 1. And that all worked out well. And based on that, now, from a scientific point of view, we're actually happy and the regulators are happy enough that you can use BYOD. But now we have to address more operational issues. And there's still some patients that either don't have a device that they can use or don't want to use their own device for security or privacy reasons. So basically, I think that most patients now can, if they want to, choose their own device. There's many studies now ongoing, and that's where COVID came in as well. When you have a 50,000, 30,000 patient study, you don't want to provide 50,000 devices, and you don't even want to provide 10,000 devices. So a lot of these big studies have been done in the BYOD context, and the results so far have been very promising. So I've not seen anything really that would suggest that BYOD is not acceptable or doesn't deliver good data. I also personally think that we've been doing BYOD for more than 20 years. We just didn't call it BYOD because we've done studies with web where we didn't tell the patient how to access the web. It could be a laptop, could be a set box, which was on top of a TV, which was 30-some inch screen, or it would be a phone. And this is BYOD is the same thing because BYOD is not, the device is not the issue, it's the representation of the questionnaire on the screen is what we're trying to figure out. So I'm actually very happy where things have developed too over the last 5 years, and I think we're on the right track. And I'm with you on that one. I think that most patients, again, there are some exceptions, but most patients will be happy to use their own device. It makes it a lot easier. They always have it with them. They always keep it charged. And if it gets lost, they'll just get a new one very quickly. We all know that if the phone is gone, we'll just get a new one. And that's probably faster than if you wait for re-provisioning of a device. Having said that, we still need to accommodate patients who don't want to do that. So it's always a mix. BYOD is never 100% BYOD. We just don't know. It could be 70, could be 80, could be 90%, but there is a certain percentage that we need to provision.
Got it. Really useful explanation of BYOD there. So with these changes, and they sound like really, really important work, I think one of the barriers to adopting technology is often cost. Is it safe to assume that work that you and others have done, proving equivalence to your explanation earlier, should have, in theory, taken a chunk out of the operating costs and some of the other huge costs that are associated with taking on technology in this realm, or has that not really translated into reality?
So I think that hasn't really translated to reality yet. One of the issues is, for example, as I said, we have to have a certain number of devices ready. Now, the challenge is that we don't know where we need them and when we need them. So we still have to have the full logistical capabilities. So the number of devices may go down, but the support structure still has to be the same. And that's where we haven't realized a lot of efficiencies, therefore not a lot of cost savings yet. I think where we need to look into cost savings, if you want to look into that one, and I think we should, is basically in the overall process of how to set up a system to provide eCOA or ePRO services to patients. So there needs to be more standardization. There needs to more libraries that need out there. But when I say more libraries, I'm careful with that because we don't need 30 libraries either. So I don't think it's a good idea that every vendor has its own library, because that's the authors won't play along anyway to start with. So I think we need to come up with data standards so that everybody can have access to a library and then implement that within their own system. But it's overall, I think we need to revisit how we run these projects and how we set these up to make that more efficient. There are some good examples out there, though.
Okay. Can you share a couple?
I'd rather stay neutral.
You don't have to mention any names, but maybe.
No. Configuration is one of the things, right? So it shouldn't be a manual coding exercise to set up a questionnaire. It should be as I said, there's only 3 widgets that we're using, more or less, plus the standard stuff. So there's no need really for anyone anymore to start coding an app for clinical trials. It should be a design tool that basically can be configured by somebody who doesn't know how to code, like myself, right? I mean, my coding days are long over, so I should be able to be within a couple of days training. I should be able to set up my own diary in any given system, and we're getting there. I see more and more sophisticated design systems. I think where it's going to go one step further, and that's what we're trying as Safira as well. We're trying to do some more on that side, is automation. So, for example, I believe that we can, with the technology that we have with machine learning, artificial intelligence, that we can have a system that can read a protocol, interpret, extract the meaningful information, look into a library of pre-validated, and I use that term loosely, let's say pre-tested configurations, and make some small adjustments and configure a system or spit out or extract a configuration system that can then be used by any kind of eCOA system to be configuring their system to have it up and running. And I would say then, instead of, usually it takes 12 to 14 weeks, what you hear from most vendors. So then my thing is, I think if a computer really can do that, it can do that in 12 minutes versus 12 weeks. And that will be a real game changer. One thing I left out earlier is I'm working on a PhD right now in machine learning, artificial intelligence. As my professor said, I went from AI to AI, right? From artificial insemination to artificial intelligence. I see huge potential with that kind of technology in the eCOA ePRO space moving forward.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm curious to hear how far away we might be from that visionary state of 12 weeks to 12 minutes. Is it a 2022 solution, or are we talking 2025?
So we work closely with the university here in Ireland. So I have access to PhD students, including myself, and to master students and so on. And we're working on that. I think that we may have some prototype ready by the end of the year to show how that works. Probably even an MVP that can read a couple of protocols and so on. We're also working, what comes in handy is that the CDISC, they're working on a update to the ODM from version 1.3, I think, to 2.0. And a lot of changes that they're making, a lot of updates are on the COA space, on the PRO side of things. So we think that the independent or neutral configuration file could be the ODM file. So we're working with CDISC to utilize that as much as we can. So the idea ultimately is that you put a PDF or a Word file of a protocol in one way, and then you get a XML or a JSON file out the other day on the other side, which will then configure any kind of eCOA system that can take that file in, basically. So that's why I like CDISC. We've done these connectathons for years now, for decades, right? So now let's do the same thing with eCOA, and we're all happy.
But Willie, I'm curious. So if we can reduce that amount of time so significantly, who will stand to benefit the most? Is it the sponsors who are conducting the trials? Is it the patients?
I think everybody. Look, I'm always for win-win-win, right? Everyone has to get something out of it. I think sponsors will win because things get done cheaper and faster. And faster is probably more important than cheaper, but it's both. Patients will benefit because I think that we will be able to, again, get things done quicker, which means the studies will start sooner. which is beneficial for the patient. But I also believe that we're probably going to be in a place where we simplify some of the configurations that we currently have, so it's easier for patients to go and answer these questionnaires. I have another prediction, and again, I have been wrong before, so I'm careful with that one. But there was a recent article, I think by Ivanna, that they it's for BYOT, so bring your own technology. Basically, was the topic, and what I can see is that within site networks where they not only conduct clinical trials but also look after patients and provide patient care. These networks, they will have their own technology, which means they have an app that they communicate with their patients with to schedule meetings, to keep them engaged, to inform them about what's happening and all these kind of things. And so patients and sites and site staff, and we shouldn't underestimate site staff in this context, they are used to that technology. They're comfortable with that technology, and that's what they use on a daily basis. So just plug in an ePRO solution to that, which is basically in many ways is just a survey, right? So I think that will happen. I think that will eventually happen. Now, when as a sponsor, when you have 4 or 5 of these networks working on your study, you don't want to have to write 5 or sign 5 requirements documents and do 5 UATs with these different. You can't. That's just not feasible either, right? But if you have a generic configuration file built by an independent system that can basically configure the study according to your needs, and then these 5 systems can take that file in, then you actually know that you get the same across the different systems, right? So make the design independent from the actual platform that ultimately delivers the data or provides the questions. So I think this is the where we need to think, because again, if patients are already not only comfortable with their device, they're already comfortable with that app or with whatever technology the site staff provide or this network provides, that has huge potential. I believe. So I'm thinking that that's where it's going to go. Now, that'll be a while, right? That's not going to happen this year and probably not next year, but I like that. And I think this is where we're going to go. And that's what we're investing in right now. So we're investing in providing in the future a neutral design platform with a CDISC standardized configuration file that can then be used across different systems.
Amazing. What about adoption of this type of technology, Willie? When I was kind of involved in ePRO for a while, one commonly cited figure, and I don't know if this is true or not, 70% of trials were conducted on paper, including the collection of patient data. Now, I've heard all sorts of different percentages from 5 all the way up to 95%, but surely most trials now, if there's an eCOA element, they're collecting it electronically, or if there's a COA element, I should say, they're collecting it electronically. Is that the case, or am I making a massive assumption here?
So I think I don't believe any of these numbers, because nobody has a real number, right? So that's why it's difficult to go, and that's why usually I try not to give any specific number, because nobody knows what the numbers are. But my first thing is that we need to separate 2 things on the eCOA or the ePRO side, and that always gets lost, I think, in that discussion. We have questionnaires that patients do at home, unsupervised. And we have questionnaires that they do while they're at the visit at the site. Or now with DCT, they may do it still at home, but it's distinct time points when we need them to do that versus the diary, which is quite often on a daily basis, for example. So in the FDA guidelines, they made it quite clear that if you collect data in an unsupervised environment, that you need to have proof that they did it when they did it, that they did it according to the protocol, which is where the audit trail comes in, where they have a timestamp in there, which translates into that if you want to have a label claim based on any diary data that patients do at home unsupervised, on paper, you don't have an audit trail. Therefore, you can't prove they did it according to protocol. Therefore, it's not acceptable for the FDA. And quite often we find that it's not acceptable. Therefore, when you talk about unsupervised at home, it has to be electronic unless you just want to do nothing with that. I even have seen now that in some publications, you have to provide evidence that the data was collected properly. So it's moving. It's a moving target. If you do it at the site level, when there's a nurse that'll, breathing down your neck as a patient, make sure you do it when you're supposed to be doing that. That's a different story. There's other reasons why you would want to do it electronically, because quite often now that we have e-consent and all the other stuff, that piece of paper for PRO, for questionnaire, for an SF-36, EQ5D, and so on, it's the last piece of paper that probably patients will see in most of the studies these days. So it makes sense to do that electronically as well. And the cost factor is not as bad because you only need one device per site, not one per patient. So it's actually not that expensive compared to the diary side of things. So I think we need to separate these two things. So I do believe that diaries at home for label claim, that is 90+%. There's still some hardcore naysayers out there, and you always have them. So but that is 90+%. I'm pretty sure that nobody really tries to do trying to get any kind of claim with the regulators on a diary collected data on a paper basis. That would, again, there's some exceptions out there, but generally that is done. That ship has sailed. On the questionnaires that are being done at the site visit, that's a different story. I think that there will be quite a few still that do it on paper. And I don't really have an issue with that. I think it's not the right thing to do, but it's not as bad. We're talking about different percentages, right? So I would say we may be talking about 50% or 60% on the questionnaire side of things. On the diary, I'm 100% sure that it's close to 90+%.
Okay. No, that's helpful. And I think you talked a little bit about it then, but decentralized trials is obviously the buzzword of the moment. To all intents and purposes, is electronic patient-reported outcomes a blend of a decentralized trials by design? You're collecting data remotely. I'm curious to know how that, like, your world dovetails into the DCT world, and what considerations there might be around that beyond just the hype and buzzword of DCT.
Well, the thing is, when you look at it, when you look at who runs DCT trials, right? Most of them are these eCOA companies or these new DCT companies who also offer eCOA. So I think you can't have one without the other. So DCT is a new phenomenon. It's a new word, right? We've done DCT trials before. This is not a year or 2 years old. DCT has been around for a long time. It's just like we call it eCOA now before we call it ePRO, right? So things change sometimes, just the name, but it doesn't really change with what we're doing. So to be more patient-centric, I think it makes total sense to move a lot of things from the site to patients' homes or other places. Could be their local pharmacy where they want to do some stuff, right? Some interventions. And we always hear about that. And I've read articles from patients here in Ireland, for example, and in other countries, how long and arduous it is for them to attend a site visit during a clinical trial. And when you talk about rare diseases, they are sometimes hundreds of miles away from their specialist physician that can treat them, right? Their consultant. So I think that this DCT has huge potential. And again, not only in clinical trials, but also in patient care and so on, right? So there's huge potential there. But the data collection piece of that, most of it is still eCOA. So we're actually still talking eCOA plus, right? And I know that some companies call it eCOA plus initially, and I think this is what it is. The data collection piece is mostly ePRO, eCOA. And then you have these add-ons, which are important. Don't get me wrong, right? Don't want to downplay them, but the ultimate data collection is still ePRO. So that's what everybody who offers DCT is in the eCOA business. Whether they want to admit that or want to talk about that or not, that's a different story. But it's still eCOA in the end. Yeah,
fascinating. I guess like the percentage of data getting collected via eCOA versus more traditional methods has swung totally towards the eCOA direction versus EDC, right?
And EDC, look, there's EDC has been around for a long time and probably will be around for quite a while as well. But the changes have happened, and the EDC side will change and has changed. Now we're talking about source data, basically collection and so on, integration. We talk about integration with electronic health records for 20 years or something like that. But things are now kind of happening. And I think some of that is the new technology that we have. But most of the data collected right now in these DCT trials is still coming from patients directly, right? It's not necessarily from sites or site staff.
And you don't have to name names on this one. You can plead the fifth by all accounts, but lots of companies are trying to dominate like the data acquisition space across the whole board platform, they call it, versus historically people have tried to nail a niche and be good at one thing. Can you give us like your thoughts on that? And I'm sure there's pros and cons to both, so it can be balanced.
Look, as you say, there's pros and cons to both. It's we just don't know, or I shouldn't say we don't know, but I think in many ways it's a personal preference, let's put it that way, right? Or it's a professional preference, right? Some companies believe in best of breed, right? So they just plug and play, and others say, okay, I'd rather take the platform, and it may not be the best e-consent solution, it may not be the best eCOA solution, or it may not be the best EDC solution, but overall the platform is actually pretty good. So these things are happening, are still in discussion. If you go to various channels on the internet, you will see there's a lot of discussion going on about that, and that has been going on also for like 15 or 20 years by now, right? That probably will never change.
It's like whoever asks the question, it's their own kind of perception of what that should be or not. Yeah,
that is correct. But what I think is, for example, technology has moved on. We have now APIs where it's easier to connect different technologies together, which we didn't have years and years ago. We've got these automation pieces that bring two technologies together as a third party that sits in between. So there's different ways now to do that successfully. I always find though, and I mean, that was like probably 20 years ago when I was at Parexel, we did some analysis on the eCOA side actually at the time already, and on the EDC side as well. I think we just need to look at who's most affected by that. And my take always was, if we have to do more work in the back end, which means if I have more work for the project manager or for a data manager or for a developer, but I reduce the time that a CRA spends on a page by 1 or 2 minutes, or I make it easier for patients to be compliant, then that's definitely always worth it. I may have to spend more upfront on the technology side, but I'll try with every work that we do and everything we look at to look at what is the easiest for the patient when we talk about ePRO, and what's the easiest for the main user of an EDC system, which is site staff and CRAs. And I think the guy attended plenty of courses on design thinking principles and so on. So you need to look at the end user, right? And if a coder or developer has to do another 6 weeks of validation, testing, development, wherever it is, then so be it. Then that's what needs to get done. So I think you can ask me the same question another 10 years, and I will probably get the same answer again, because this is really, both are valid approaches. The platform, as much as the best of breed, either works. At the same time, when you look around, there are not many one-trick ponies around anymore, right? So this that you only have one system and you only do that one, I think we're past that point. Most eCOA vendors have other services now that they offer, either through acquisition, mergers, or development. Most of them now have an e-consent solution that they can tack on easily. So I think it's going in the right direction, or not right, but it's going in the direction of more platforms. The question is, how big does a platform, how many different services do you need to offer?
Got it. No, very diplomatic but informative answer. And I guess that's a good kind of segue into what you're doing now at Zafira. So it sounds like there's a lot going on in the space. There's like everything in our space, highly regulated, very process driven. Tell us a bit about Zafira, like the problems that you solve, who you're working with.
At Zafira, we work with, we want to be the one-stop shop, but we are the one-stop shop within eCOA. So whatever problem whoever you are, have, we can help. Let's put it that way. That's what we wanted to do, and that's how we set out. So, which means we work with sponsors. We do a lot of training. So we basically train and make them aware of what's happening. We talked about a few things today with ecological momentary assessment. Sometimes I think because we've done it for 20 plus years, it gets kind of lost by now. People don't remember that the reason why we do eCOA is not because it's cool to enter your stuff into a mobile phone versus into a paper diary. There are scientific reasons, scientific evidence why we do that. And I think some people that come to the industry now just don't have that background anymore. And sometimes I see requests what they want to do, where I'm just like, no, you're now mimicking paper, and that's what we don't want, right? We want to get away from that. There's a reason why we do the things the way we do them. So what we do a lot of training, a lot of courses and one-on-one sessions. We help pharma companies to figure out what is it that they actually need. And then once they understand what they need, then we help them with coming up with a process how to evaluate different vendors and find the right vendor for their project or for whatever they want to do. We also work with quite a few vendors and help them to review their product. So what is missing on the product roadmap or the existing product. So we do quite a bit of consulting on that side of things. But we also offer, for example, UAT as a service. Current regulations and previous regulation made it very clear that sponsors have to do the user acceptance testing at the end, independently from the vendor that they chose to develop the solution. It sounds very trivial, but a good UAT is not that trivial. So we figured that out over the last few years. I've been doing this now for 7 or 8 years. Gauri's been doing this for a lot longer than I have. And she and her team and our team now, we're actually specializing in that to a certain degree. So we help sponsors to do it right, basically. But we also work with technology companies to make sure that they offer the right support and that they have the right processes in place so that it doesn't become that annoying little task that needs to be done at the end of the project before you go live, because we're always the last ones that have to check the box that now the system can go live. So we're always under pressure. But we're working with both with vendors and sponsors to make that as fluent and as easy as possible. But again, always keeping independence. So we're working on behalf of the sponsor with tech companies. And then one of the other things that I started 8 or 9 years ago is license management. It's one of the biggest issues right now in the industry is that it's so difficult and it's so lengthy, a lengthy process to get licenses in place. And then basically you get the license for the paper version, which you're allowed to migrate, but then you have to do the migration, then you have to do screen review. It's a very long process, and especially if the questionnaire hasn't been translated in the languages that you need, then there's even more complexity to that. And it's not a pretty place right now, I have to say, in that space. So a lot of studies get delayed because we can't get the licenses in time. And it's because it's not complicated, but it's complex. There's a lot of moving parts, and we're trying to minimize that as well. So we're working on a couple of tech solutions as well within Saphira that will help us in the future to make that simpler. So for a start, we have a database of about 500 some questionnaires with all the details, who you need to contact, telephone number, if we have email address, what's the process, who needs to sign what contract, who needs to sign what form. All this we have basically, so that when we have new people starting, but also for us to be more efficient. So instead of then having tried to find out who it is that we need to talk to, we already know that. We already know who, we know how to escalate. We have escalation procedures in place. So if you don't get the answer right away, you know who to talk next to get to make things happening, and that works reasonably well. So we're doing this. So anything in the eCOA space that needs to get done, we're on the operation side as well on the product side. We're helping everyone involved basically, and I have a lot of fun doing that as well. It's a never, as I said, I've got my 25th anniversary coming up next year. And I never anticipated that I'll be doing this, what I'm doing right now for such a long time, but it's never boring. There's always something new to do.
It's awesome. I can hear the enthusiasm in your voice as you talk to it. And I think what's come across today is that eCOA, it might sound like a simple concept, but like everything in this space, there is layer upon layer of potential complexity here. We like to finish on that. We ask, if there's one thing that you could change about our industry, what would that be?
So I think that a lot of challenges that we see in our industry right now are coming from the lack of knowledge sharing and knowledge retention. So we're getting involved quite often, sometimes late in the stage, kind of these rescue missions when the stakes are high and the pressures are on. And what we find quite often is a lot of that could have been avoided if there would be more knowledge sharing and more knowledge retention. Again, I mentioned it already twice today, the fact that we come from ecological momentary assessment, right? We want to make sure that patients can enter it when it happens, not a day later or 2 weeks later. This sometimes gets lost in translation. Same thing with the widgets. There's only 3 widgets, and there's some rules or some suggestions from the ePRO consortium that we put together probably by now, 8 or 9 years ago. And these are still out there. And then with one of my friends, Bill Byram, we wrote a book on how to do it as well. I'm just pitching that now because we're not making any money. We donate all the money to 2 charities, but we just try to educate overall people, because what we quite often see is that the lack of understanding and the lack of depth of knowledge in the eCOA space quite often on the vendor side as much as on the sponsor side and the CROs as well. It's sometimes I think is the underlying issue that we have in the industry. There's that knowledge retention and sharing is the biggest problem. So if we can find some way to improve that, I think a lot of the challenges that we currently have would go away. So that would be the one thing that I would want, all about sharing, right? And that's why I do what I do here today with you guys as well, right? I just want to make sure that it's an interesting field. As I said, 24 years, never thought I'm going to be here more than 2 years. I'm still here and I still enjoy every day, and so does everybody.
It's a great kind of note to end on, you sharing knowledge on this podcast and hopefully getting it out to the masses as well. Now, perfect, Willie. I hear great things about the culture that you're building at Zafira. And if people want to get in touch with you, where should they reach out?
The best way to reach out is just drop me a line at willie.muehlhausen@zafira.partners, or on LinkedIn. You'll find me on LinkedIn. That's the best way of reaching out to us.
Awesome. And I envisage a potential part 2 here, where some of this innovation that you talked about, particularly as it pertained to that capturing the protocol and how that translates downstream into the building of diaries in an automated way. I'm fascinated to see how that plays out. So thanks so much for your time, Willie, today, and look forward to catching up and connecting again soon. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you soon.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have suggestions for a guest for our show, write to hosts@transformationintrials.com. You can find more episodes in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and the show notes are available at transformationintrials.buzzsprout.com. Thank you for listening.